Welcome to this panel on how banks are delivering on net zero with a French and UK perspective. This panel is organized by the French Banking Federation and by UK Finance. So we are at COP27 in Egypt, and of course this COP is meant to be the conference at which commitments are translated into action with the urgency to transit to net zero. And for that reason, with my colleague from UK Finance, we thought of gathering panelists with banks, operating both in France, the UK, and worldwide, in order to assess, where banks are in their pathway to net zero. So the panel will explore different points. The first thing they will explore is, of course, the current situation and progress to date. A second part will be dealing with what remains to be done. A third part will be on challenges and solutions for the future. So I pass the microphone to my colleague Ian Bhullar from UK Finance, and I hope we all have a good panel.
Thank you very much, Séverine. And thank you all to the panelists for joining us. I'll introduce the panelists briefly, and then we'll launch straight into a set of questions, first on intros and progress to date. So joining us today, we have from the French Banking Federation, Degouve, who is Head of Sustainable Finance at the FBF and also co-leads the implementation work track at the Net Zero Banking Alliance. We'll then have Jacques from the UK Transition Plan Taskforce, team leader at the Secretariat and also group policy lead at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group. Linda French from JP Morgan, global head of ESG policy and regulation. And Antoine Cyr, head of engagement at BNP Paribas. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's start by hearing about two work streams on either side of the channel, looking to support banks and the wider economy in delivering on their decarbonisation commitments. So starting with Karen first, could you tell us about the French Banking Federation's work on the common methodology?
Thank you, Ian. Maybe I should start by saying that all large French banks have actually signed up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance because that was the starting point of our work. In the NZBA, there's no prescriptive methodology on how to measure carbon emissions of banking portfolio, and there's no common methodology on how to set targets. There are principal guidelines that have been set up back in 2021 when the alliance went live, but there's no detailed methodology, which means that each bank can actually choose its own way of doing things. So we felt at the French Banking Federation and with our members, the 6 largest French banks, which cover most of the French banking assets, that we needed a common approach to make things comparable between banks. So we started working earlier this year for about 6 months, a little bit more than 6 months, on defining a common approach. So we first looked at the different methodologies that existed out there. We did a benchmark of our peers and what was being done in the market. We ran a dummy portfolio, as we say, to test the different methodologies. And the results were actually striking because depending on the methodology that you use, you get very different results. Hence, that confirmed our intention of having something that would be, common rules to be comparable. So working on this, on this common approach, we basically resulted in a set of 9 common features, key features of a way to calculating carbon emissions and setting targets. I won't name the 9 approaches, but maybe just a few of them to illustrate what I'm talking about. So we agreed on the common scope first, with on and off balance sheet exposures, which is quite important. All maturities, including the short-term trade finance maturities, for example. We agreed that we would cover all sectors, excluding the financial sector for the time being, because it's quite difficult to assess the finance sector by transparency of what you actually have in the portfolios. And we agreed that we would cover all clients, all sectors, with the exception for the time being of sovereigns, for exactly the same reason, sovereigns and public local authorities. On the metric, we agreed that we would use the metric to allocate client emissions would be the gross exposure. Same thing, that's really important to define whether it's gross or net or what you cover to make things comparable. We agreed to use the same benchmark, which is globally for sectors including that are included in the IEA net zero emission NZD 2050 scenario. But we also agreed that for sectors that are not covered by NZD 2050, like agriculture, for example, we would work on a common scenario with the actually with ADEME in France. We also agreed, and that's a very important point, to use common data. And for data that we're not able to collect directly, that banks are not able to collect directly from clients, that we would use a common set of proxies for emission factors. So, and finally, maybe to mention that we also agreed to use the same approach to deal with the multi-counting of Scope 3 emissions from clients. And that's a key point as well, because it can make quite a huge difference whether you retreat the multi-counting or whether you don't. So that was important. So basically, that's the work that we've done. There's still quite a lot to do, and the common approach is now defined. Banks are not obliged to use it. It's really a common framework that's in place that will need to evolve because it was built in an evolving environment with a regulation evolving, with standard setters evolving as well, with the EFRAG in Europe, with ISSB and so on. So the methodology is really just a way of putting things in common that anybody can use. It's public now. It's actually on the website of the FBF. So rules are out there. People can use it. Other banks can use it. We hope that other banks within NZBA will be using it, and it will evolve over time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. Jacques, on to you. The Transition Plan Task Force has a broader remit covering both the real economy and financial services. I wonder if you can say a little bit about the origin of that work and also your progress to date.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for having me. I mean, as a half French Brit interested in finance, this panel is like, ticks a lot of boxes for me. So the Transition Plan Task Force, or the TPT, was an announcement at COP26 from then Chancellor, now Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, really to develop a gold standard for transition plans in the UK, covering both the financial sector and real economy. And this is as part of a wider announcement on the move towards mandatory transition planning in the UK. So the task force is a group of CEOs from finance and real economy, regulators in the UK and the UK Treasury. And a year on from an announcement at COP26, on Tuesday, before Finance Day at COP27, we launched our first major output, which was a framework, a disclosure framework for transition plans and some implementation guidance. So the disclosure framework is really the what. So if you're making a transition plan, what should it include? And we've picked up on the 5 key elements that GFANs have put forward in their own guidance on transition planning. So the foundation, so really what are your targets? What's your overall climate ambition? Your implementation strategy, how are you fundamentally changing your business model to arrange for the products and services that are required for the transition? Your engagement strategy, how are you talking to your supply chain? How are you engaging with governments, civil society? How are you setting out the sort of policy changes that are required to implement your plan? The metrics and targets, so not just GHG emissions, but also looking at financial metrics, capital expenditure, and the use of carbon credits, and governance. So how are you, holding yourself to account? Who's responsible for your transition plan in your business? And then the guidance really sets out the how. So what are the core steps that any institution should go through to prepare a transition plan? And the when and the where. So how should you actually publish this? How do you communicate it? So we recommend that a transition plan should be published every 3 years as a standalone document, and material updates should be on an annual basis as part of a company's financial reporting. So this is all, a really holistic approach to transition planning. A key thing to note is that the Financial Conduct Authority is closely involved in the UK, and we expect the FCA to use the TPT's outputs as they update reporting requirements in the UK. So this is really, it's a pathway to regulation. We're really trying to encourage the movement from simple promises to actual plans. I think at COP27, we've all seen lots more talk around specific actions that the market can be taking. And I think that the TPT's outputs really, really support this. And another thing I'd say is that there are multiple use cases for transition plans, right? So, not just for civil society and wider shareholders to hold companies to account, but really also as an internal tool within a business. We've heard so much from the many, many companies that we've engaged with about the fact that preparing a transition plan was a really useful exercise to bring all of the key elements together, bring everything that all of the climate change, sustainability areas in the business, escalate the key issues to the board, to senior management, and also having that element of transparency creates encouragement and an element of competitiveness in the market. But also from regulators in terms of micro and macro prudential supervision, identifying specific firms' progress on their commitments, but also economy-wide. So, transition plans really are, I think, a fundamental tool in the architecture that is needed for net zero, and we hope that the TPT's outputs can really start to help the market as much as possible with that.
Thanks very much, Jacques. Antoine, on to you. BNP Paribas has really been a leader in this space, co-signing GFANZ and the Net Zero Banking Alliance as one of the first in April 2021. Could you say a little bit about how BNP Paribas has implemented its commitments to decarbonisation? And I will pass this over to you.
Thank you, Ian. So at BNP Paribas, of course, we are a French bank. We have been created in France and are headquartered in Paris. But we are now the largest bank in the European Union, and we operate also in Americas and in Asia. And the preparation of the different countries, the public opinion, the behaviors of regulators, of banks, of business in the various countries and spaces are really different. And we have to find a way to define a policy for the bank, which is a proper policy applying in countries that are so different. And we found that the best common denominator for our net zero alignment is the client. Because at the end of the day, we are not here to decarbonize the bank. We are here to contribute to decarbonize the real economy. So the way we address the NZBA challenge is to see what we can do to decarbonize, to contribute to the decarbonization of the economy. Because if at the end of the day our portfolio is decarbonized, but the economy is not decarbonized, we are still dead. So it's not the good way to do. So we rely on 3 pillars. The first pillar is the commitments we take and how we organize to transform those commitments in client decisions. So we have taken NZBA commitment, but we call them NZBA, but they are not NZ for us, they are our commitments. And what we have to do is to organize ourselves to deliver the commitment. For example, we committed to reduce our financing of upstream oil and gas by 25% between 2020 and 2025. So how do we deliver this commitment? it's a question. We committed to reduce by 25% the carbon footprint of the automotive industry we finance between 2020 and 2025. How we make this commitment, client decisions, and how we make it operational. So we created a team called Climate Analytics and Alignment, which is already a quite important team who is there to modelize how our commitment transforms into a transformation of our portfolio, and how this can convert into client advice decisions that will have an influence on really decarbonizing the economy. It's a contribution. We know we are not the economy. We are just a bank. We have to be very modest on this. But if we can help to something, it's to take client decisions that contribute to decarbonize the economy. So first pillar is a commitment. Second pillar, and we know that a lot of the competition is here, and we can see a lot of our friends and competitors is having an absolutely very good workforce of commercial people, of senior bankers, of people who are specialized into energy transition and who are able to accompany the client to make sure that no good project of decarbonization is left without the proper funding and the best solution. So this is something we ensure with the large companies, with the large corporates, with a group we created, which is called the Low Carbon Transition Group, with 250 full-time senior bankers that are fully dedicated to the energy transition of our large corporates. And this is a setup we are now duplicating for all the SMEs, which are our client over Europe. So that's the idea, to have this on the client, and these people may be able to tap in all the experts we have over the group worldwide. And we created a network of our 400 sustainability experts over the world, to be able that we can tap on their expertise each time it's needed for a client. So really, it's really client driven. And finally, and this third point is absolutely essential, you need to have the governance, the infrastructure, and the data. So we completely changed and adapt our governance and our processes. We have a committee which is chaired by our CEO, which take all the important decisions of the bank regarding the climate. We have created groups that are working on infrastructures and that are making really the ESG case part of the industrial case of the company. So we are implementing a very important industrial data transformation in the group, and clearly ESG data is completely intricated in this transformation. We tend to hate silos, and we try to avoid the data transformation of ESG being done outside the data transformation of the bank. It's absolutely key to have this completely intertwined. So so I could explain it for hours, but I guess it's enough to give you a kind of overarching view of what we do.
Thank you very much, Antoine. That's really exciting institutional developments. Linda, last but absolutely not least, JP Morgan also joined the Net Zero events before COP26 in October last year. I wonder if, like Antoine, you can say a little bit about how the organization is implementing its decarbonization commitments, with perhaps a particular focus on the UK and EU, but perhaps also globally.
Thanks, Ian. So I think it's important to note, starting off, that we did sign up to NZBA in October 2021, but we actually set our first portfolio emissions reductions targets earlier in the year in May of last year. So we worked with a leading environmental consultant to set targets for 3 of our most carbon intensive portfolios. So oil and gas, electric power, and automotive manufacturing. And we also separately set a target to finance and facilitate 2.5 trillion in sustainable finance over the next 10 years, with 1 trillion of that aimed at climate green finance, so renewable energy, green technology. So we're coming at this from both reducing emissions on the one hand, and also facilitating and growing green finance. So in terms of what implementing this kind of looks like in practice, because this is the implementation COP after all, the portfolio emissions reduction targets are owned by the business. So we set up a Center for Carbon Transition in our corporate and investment bank, and it did a really significant resource build out. So they are, so the work is deeply embedded in the business, and we're bringing together that deep understanding of individual clients, of different sectors, and then also what those science-based pathways are going to look like. The Center for Carbon Transition then also works really closely hand in hand with dedicated client teams that are focused on capital markets and green products. And so, for example, we have an ESG solutions team that manages the ESG work streams of capital markets and M&A transactions that's embedded in deal teams. So working alongside investment banking products and industry coverage teams. We also have a global markets sustainability center, and they're really driving the firm's efforts in providing sustainability solutions to institutional investors. So going back to our targets, I mean, we're really taking a global approach. So this is about, for each of those 3 portfolios, looking at each client in each portfolio, and then making sure that we have an understanding of what their current trajectory is between now and 2030, and then how does it compare to our 2030 targets. So we are building out extensive internal analytics, effectively a dashboard kind of approach. And so looking at, so for each client, what's their trajectory over the last 2 years? Where are they currently? And then what does the trajectory look like between now and 2030? And then how does that compare to our trajectory for our 2030 targets? And as Antoine was mentioning as well, I mean, the importance of having really robust independent internal governance and around that process and around those analytics. So that process gives us an understanding of kind of where clients are and where they're headed, so that we're able to tell kind of which ones are going to need more intensive support. So that gets us into, I think, the discussion of like what transition finance actually looks like. Like, what does that support look like? And we can help them shift their business by adding less carbon intensive business, reducing more carbon intensive business, M&A, advisory. So for example, developing new carbon capture technology, hydrolysis technology, hydrogen, helping them raise capital through ESG products. So sustainability linked loans with strong KPIs, green bonds. But I think an important point to make here is that most of the transition finance that's going to be needed is actually going to be traditional vanilla like banking activity. And it will, in traditional and vanilla in the sense of, M&A, advisory, kind of capital markets activity. And this is also why, our targets include not just lending, but also capital markets activity, because we do think that, there's certainly a role for ESG and green products. We're one of the top underwriters of green bonds. But I think we're generally seeing a bit of an overemphasis in the public dialogue around around the role of green products. So I think to sum up, what's important here and for us is the internal analytics to understand each of our clients' kind of trajectories and challenges, so that and then having the expertise to be able to work with clients to address their specific challenges. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Linda, and really helpful to hear about those vast sums of capital that you mentioned at the beginning, which is so crucial as the mobilization of capital remains such a challenge. For the next set of questions, I'll hand it to Séverine.
Thank you. So now we are opening the session on the next step on the voluntary initiatives. And for that, I'll turn first to Jacques and then to Karen. So Jacques, we understand there's a lot of work that's been going on the transition plan initiatives task force, and that you are also considering to support the transition plan delivery and also to make firms accountable. So could you tell us more, about your plans for the coming months?
Yeah, of course. And thinking about plans for the next coming months almost sort of makes me nervous, because we've been racing for 7 months so far with the team to really set up what we've got so far. But yeah, we can say a bit on that. So the framework and the guidance that we launched for consultation on Tuesday, so that closes at the end of February. So I'd encourage all stakeholders who have a keen interest in transition planning, which should be everyone, to take part in that consultation. We also launched a sandbox. So this is a safe space for companies to really test our outputs, because we are aware that unless we take on views, perspectives, insights from the market, from yourselves on how best to implement this, we won't have as much take up. So we're really hoping to test all that with all corners of the market. Next year we'll be also developing some sector specific guidance. So at the moment, the framework and the guidance that we've developed is sector neutral, but we will be looking at specific financial subsectors, and it's so interesting to hear work on baselining that you mentioned, on governance, and so we'd really like to take that into account. But one really important thing is on international engagement. So the framework and guidance on transition planning that we've created was created in the UK, but it has global transferability. So the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is creating a global baseline on sustainability disclosures, climate disclosures, is closely involved with our work. And in fact, we have held an event with the ISSB and GFANZ, a couple of events at the COP so far, where the ISSB really recognizes the TPT's work as the UK's approach. It's almost like the building block on the global baseline. So we really see that international convergence and alignment as key in order to have a properly global transition. We are also engaging with international bodies such as IOSCO, the NGFS, and even I think a couple of days ago, maybe yesterday, I think we heard from the Bundesbank about the importance of transition planning at the NGFS and also for the German central bank. So there's real momentum here on transition planning. The UN high-level expert group's own recommendations on transition planning are incredibly well aligned with the TPT. And I just came from a panel with one of the members of that group. So we're really trying to harness all of this momentum, and we want to engage with other jurisdictions who are developing their own disclosure regimes in a supportive movement towards regulation and international adoption and convergence. So no small task for next year. Further sector-specific guidance, more international engagement, and more testing, all on the road to regulation within the UK.
Okay, so thank you for these very inspiring initiatives and all the work you do. And indeed, the momentum, I think, is the word that everybody would agree on. And so, Karen, on the transition plans delivery, there's also some further works you're considering as a next step, for the common methodology that you described. So could you tell us more about it?
So the first step was for the banks to actually release their interim objectives. And it's interesting, I don't know if everybody saw, but yesterday the NZBA released its first progress report that shows that more than 60 banks have set interim targets 2030 or before. Amongst those, most of the French banks have. But before the end of the year, all the French banks, all the major French banks will have disclosed their interim targets. And then banks have 12 months from that to disclose their actual transition plan and how they're going to put this in action. But you need to understand that before, when you set a target, even though it may not be disclosed, you already have a transition plan. And I think that's what Antoine was saying. You can't set a target without knowing what you're going to do to be able to reach that target. So action plans have actually been already not yet disclosed by the different banks. They've already been worked on. And as Antoine said, the common denominator is clients. So there'll be a lot of work being done around how do you accompany your clients into that transition for each of the sectors. And it's about client tiering, about client engagement, about what kind of sustainable products you can develop, and so on. So it's not just about reducing emissions and carbon accounting. It's how do you go from carbon accounting, which is the baseline, to setting targets, to actually putting things into action. And that's where the interesting bit is. As far as the federation is concerned, obviously this is for each bank to be, being responsible for its own transition plan. But there's still quite a lot of work ahead of us. First, we agreed that we would be at some point in the future working on a common indicator that might be a temperature, but it could be something else, which is more understandable than absolute value carbon emissions, not to drive the transition, but to actually talk to the market and have something which is, in terms of communication, that is easy to understand. So we will have that additional work. We will have additional work around the data, obviously. Antoine and Linda mentioned how data is important, how adapting IT systems is important, how preparing for our upcoming regulation is important. In Europe, we have the ESG Pillar 3 coming our way, which obviously needs, means that European banks will need to, are fastly working on improving their IT systems to be able to include that additional regulation into their IT systems. That will be additional work. And maybe in the longer term, I should mention that we will expand from climate to nature as well, impacts and dependencies, risk and opportunities, because it's not just about climate, it's also about the entire environment, data-wise, but also client engagement-wise. So a lot of work still ahead of us, short, medium, and long term.
Thank you very much, Karen. On to the next set of questions for you, Linda and Antoine. It's clear that the implementation of transition plans and decarbonisation commitments is facing headwinds this year in particular from the war in Ukraine, rising oil and gas prices. I wonder if you can say a little bit about the challenges that you see in the implementation of your commitments, and in particular how you're looking to overcome them to implement full and rapid decarbonisation. Linda, you first.
Great, thanks, Ian. So I think it goes without saying that the current geopolitical environment is incredibly challenging. In terms of challenges for banks more broadly, because I don't think this is specific to us. I think we're all facing many of the same issues. The challenges that our challenges are really the challenges that our clients are facing. And there are so many dependencies that are out of companies' direct control. So, to your initial question, absolutely, governments are very worried about rising energy prices and the impact on consumers and voters. So, one way in which that shows up is, for example, you have a regulated utility that has coal-fired power plants, and is looking to switch on a lot more renewable energy, but regulators, being worried that that switching on more renewable energy will increase costs for consumers. So the regulator's saying, no, you need to keep the coal-fired power plants online. Is going to be out of the picture. For example, electric vehicle is very dependent on charging stations, transmission lines, and we're not going to see the consumer demand that we need if the infrastructure isn't there. So, I think we've seen some policymakers even publicly express challenges with running out of electric power while driving along, the motorway. So I think in terms of solutions, it's really, making the point to governments that yes, we're going to need to meet short-term energy needs, but we also need huge investment in building out the infrastructure and creating the right economic incentives for renewable energy to come online. So this really has to be about the entire ecosystem.
So I concur with all what was said by Linda. Maybe what I can add is that first we are in a very challenging times in terms of public opinions, particularly because the world is divided and the societies, each component of the world is also divided. So it makes it extremely challenging, and maybe as banks we are not that used to be drawn into so complicated challenges. So it's somewhat new for us, and at one moment we really need the governments to set at a very high level the public policies and the objectives, which is not that clear. They have roadmap, okay, but when we go a bit closer to what will be the future of food, what will be the future of agriculture, what will be, how do we deal with energy efficiency of housing, these are elements where we need to have public policies. We believe a government has not to be too granular in the way we reach the objectives, but it's good to set the target. And for the moment, we believe that the public policy are not that clear. At least that's what we feel in Europe. We have European Green Deal, but we don't have that many public policies that really say, I would say, sector by sector and activity by activity where we want to go. So this is really, I believe, a missing link. Another point is that we have to transform profoundly our organizations to meet the climate challenge. And at the same time, so meeting profoundly our organization means changing organizations, changing the skills. We worked with Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership in UK to upskill our people worldwide in sustainability. So you need to change the people, and at the time you are changing the people, you are telling to make them ready to learn a lot of new skills. You have to tell them, yes, you will be a better banker and a better person. So you have to convince the people to change the culture, and at the same time you can see here a pushback by a government, here an NGO who says that what the people are doing accounts for nothing. So you can see a lot of elements that are perturbating what you have to do to change your workforce and to change your organization. So you need to keep very steady, to have a very clear vision of what your organization has to do, and at the same time to be very agile and to understand what are the winds around you. But at the end of the day, you have to stick to the objectives that we have to help the decarbonization. But it needs a kind of capacity to stay firm in our convictions, which it's probably very new that being so faithful to our strategy is challenged by so many complicated issues going in one direction or the other. So it's challenging.
Thank you very much, Antoine, and thank you, Linda. I think we'll conclude with two very quick rapid fire questions. I'll do one, and then Séverine will take the second. The first is particularly to Jacques and Karen, but also to Linda and Antoine, if you want to add anything. What are some of the key lessons that we can share and exchange between France and the UK on thinking about transition planning? I'll pass to Karen first.
I think the key lesson learned from the work that we've been doing is how important the collaborative approach is. Putting together in one room, bringing together banks who are competitors at the end of the day on sustainable finance, building something in common is not necessarily easy. But it's very useful. That's what we're doing at the French Banking Federation with only 6 banks. And we've achieved a lot. That's what we're trying to do within NZBA with 122 banks, which is a greater challenge because of the diversity of perspective. But the collaborative approach is definitely very, very important. And that would be my main lesson. The second lesson would be prepared and be agile for any evolution, because we're in an environment that's changing very, very quickly. Regulation definitely has a huge impact on our work. I mentioned Pillar 3 ESG, but we also have soft regulation. I heard 2 days ago, for example, the UN's high-level expert group on net zero commitments of non-state entities, which I was not even aware of, 2 days ago, that released guidelines saying, and I quote Catherine McKenna, who's the chair, "You cannot claim to be net zero while continuing to build and invest in new fossil fuel supply." And that's, that can have a huge impact on the work that we're doing if that becomes the rule, for example. So be agile and be collaborative.
Thanks, and I would definitely agree on the collaboration, which is absolutely the foundation of the TPT's work. And we've also been engaging quite closely with the UN high-level expert group. I'll give two quick reflections. So the first is a key conceptual innovation within the framework is that we recommend that entities take a strategic and rounded approach towards the transition. So this is, beyond the narrow approach of paper decarbonization that can have its negative incentives, and really contributing to and preparing for the economy-wide transition. So in the UK, this is supporting the UK's net zero 2050 target, and I think that points to Antoine's comments on really supporting the economy decarbonization. So that really is a central part of our transition plan recommendations, and the 19 disclosure elements within the work are all embed that approach. So that is aligned with the TPT should put forward a strategic and rounded approach. The second is on the incorporation of wider sustainability issues like nature, like social impacts that we've touched on. So the TPT has started to do this. We recommend an approach where entities consider the material interdependencies between their emissions reduction target and these wider issues: nature, social impacts, workers, communities. So for example, over the summer in France, we saw that the production of nuclear energy was impacted by droughts. And I think a successful and high quality transition plan would articulate these sorts of physical risks on the impacts on the entity's own decarbonization commitment. So these are the sorts of dependencies that we are really asking entities to start considering when they're planning their transition plan process, and then communicating that to all relevant stakeholders to really, you know, have the near-term action and really get going on it.
Great, thanks. So I'll echo much of what you both said around, you know, one key lesson being the need for coordination, not just on regulation, but also on broader government policy that kind of enables the transition. You know, which I think is why COP is so important, is getting that broader dialogue, not just between developing countries, but also developing countries and emerging, or developed countries, but also developed countries and emerging markets. And because I mean, I'm stating the obvious, but you know, one country isn't going to do this alone. The second key lesson is, I think we've, you know, learned over the last year, is the need to actively engage the industry, including international firms, because, you know, for large banks, our clients aren't just located in one jurisdiction. So, you know, we need the expertise and the capabilities to support clients globally, and, you know, also make sure that we aren't leaving emerging markets of clients behind.
So I see a little to add. Maybe just from a private sector perspective, we can say that the France and UK cooperation works very well. Our CEO is member of the Financial Services Taskforce initiated by the United Kingdom. I was a co-chair of the group that created a task force for nature-based financial disclosures with Rhian Marie-Thomas of the Green Finance Institute in UK. So it's very interesting to see that the way private banks, who are very important actors in the society and who have an important role to play for environmental and social challenges of the society. We can see that there is a good alignment and a good cooperation between for us as a private players. So it's I'm very optimistic. I'm not completely optimistic for the climate, because if we want to be able to do all the efforts needed, we have to be pessimistic in the analysis and optimist in the action, but pessimistic in the analysis. But for cooperation, I'm relatively confident that we understand well which are the areas for competition and which are the areas where cooperation can bring us better in the interest of the society, because what justifies our cooperation is the interest of the society.
Thank you very much. I'll pass to Séverine.
Okay, so thank you very much to all you, four of you. It was very interesting, you know, to hear about the progress so far, but also the upcoming work and the solution and challenges. So it's been now what we'd like you to do in maybe 30 seconds each is to say what you would expect of COP27. So starting, whoever wants to start first.
Yeah, I think what I mostly think this COP should achieve really is just keep the 1.5 degrees alive. Keep it the target, even if it's increasingly, as we can see, out of reach. And maybe adding that, so we look for governments and policymakers to achieve that. The private sector, there's so much that the private finance sector can do. We can't be in the driver's seat, but we are definitely ready to bolster government action. And yeah, that's probably the key message. Keep the 1.5 alive. We can't be in the driver's seat, but we're ready. And in his opening remarks, I love that sentence from Antonio Guterres, who said, we're on the climate highway to hell, and we have our foot on the accelerator. Well, I hope governments find the brake.
Thanks. A key reflection from me is moving from promises to plans. And I think that really encompasses a lot around what the TPT is doing, but there is so much momentum here at COP27. You know, COP26, we had big grand announcements. COP27, we're seeing more on delivery, more on implementation. So moving from promises to plans, focusing on near-term action and building the financial architecture that's needed for net zero.
I think this COP has been successful in like emphasizing the importance of emerging markets and the recognition that the transition isn't going to be linear. It's going to look different across across different sectors, across different geographies. So I think my hope for COP is that that we see real progress on creating the right enabling environment for companies to transition, because it's not just about holding companies accountable, but this much bigger picture here about incentives and infrastructure, and all those pieces needing to be in place.
So for the political side, I couldn't agree more with all of you. I would add that we are here in the COP. We are a large number of financial institutions, of public institutions, of corporates, and we are all working now really on very concrete solutions. And being there together is really an accelerator. Each time we meet, we meet a lot of people who have been working for months on solutions, on new projects, and even if we know, for example, as banks, we all know our clients very well, but sometimes you discover that something that deserves to be accelerated in common is there. And the COP is really the good place. It's now really the good place for cooperation between public, private, and a lot of NGOs, a lot of institutions who are there, may spark new cooperation or brainstorm. Yesterday we had brainstorming sessions with some public sector institutions that may prove very fruitful in a few months. So it's good to have a place which is dedicated to policy, to politics, but also for the practitioners who are working on concrete solutions.
Thank you very much, Antoine. And thank you to all the panelists. I'm hoping that this will be the start of an ongoing collaboration, or a continuation of an ongoing collaboration between our relative institutions. I'll also say a couple of other thank yous. Thanks to the Bankers for Net Zero team for hosting us here in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you to those of us who are joining in person and also those online. And finally, thanks to the speakers, Antoine, Linda, Jacques, and Karen. Really a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.